Thank you for joining us today for the VU Ltd Practical Guide for Getting Back to Work series. The focus of today's webinar is on the legal and HR issues of returning to work. Everyone is joined in listen-only mode, so please use the chat box to ask questions as we go. My coordinator will look out for these and bring them to my attention. And we'll also have time for questions and answers at the end. I'm Victor Ubogu, founder of VU Ltd, a sports travel and hospitality business. Alongside me are Jodie Hill, founder of the multi-award-winning Thrive Law. Jodie is an advocate for mental health and has the One Mind campaign to ensure mental health risk assessments are mandatory in all workplaces. She recently appeared on BBC Look North, ITV News, BBC Live, Guardian, The Times and Yorkshire Post as an expert in employment law. Hi, Jodie.
Hi. Thank you.
Catherine Spencer, who is a former England Womens Rugby Captain and founder of Inspiring Women, a specialist agency providing female keynote, motivational and after-dinner speakers. Public speaker, sports pundit, writer, and recently published her autobiography, Mud, Mall, Mascara. Hi, Catherine.
Hello, hi there.
Paul Lomas. Paul is Director of People, Change and Transformation at Bibby Financial Services, a global provider of invoice financing to the SME market. With a track record of delivering a business-focused people agenda across all organization types, Paul has previously worked across a diverse range of sectors, including manufacturing, utilities, technology, telecommunications, publishing, and professional services. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Vic. Hello, everybody.
At this point, we don't know when live events will be back up and running as we know it. I've had to adapt in the interim from sports travel and hospitality to selling bulk PPE, masks, sanitizers, and gloves. Compared to live sporting events, it's not that exciting, but I've had to adapt. My staff have been on furlough since the beginning of April and will continue to do so until end of July at the earliest. I'm still trying to balance how to bring my staff back to work against the backdrop of constantly changing government guidelines and ensuring that we remain within employment law. So Jodie, can you please update us on the current furlough scheme?
Sure. So this week actually marks the start of the flexible furlough. So we've heard a lot about flexible furlough, and really the key difference between the current furlough that people are already on is that you're allowed to have some hours that you agree to work with your employees. If you are doing that, it has to be people who are, one, already furloughed or have been furloughed prior. Two, you have to have a written agreement. And that agreement has to say which hours they will work and which hours they won't work. And that agreement needs to be agreed between the parties. So it's not just the employer saying you have to do this, because it could amount to a fundamental variation of the terms. And we're saying actually you need to keep a record of that for up to 6 years. HMRC's guidance says 5 and some says 6. So I'd go with 6 on that. And actually the other changes that are coming into play in relation to furlough is about the contribution. So it's looking at, well, what does the employer have to start to contribute? So throughout July and August, the employer is effectively contributing the same. In August, there's a little bit of pension and NI. In September, the contribution by the employer is 10%, and previously it's been 80% by the government, but that'll go down to 70%. And then again, in October, it goes down by another 10%, increasing the employers by 10%. So it will end at the end of October. There's no indication that that's going to extend beyond October. But what we are seeing is, because of the contributions, people are now looking at redundancies a little bit earlier. So it might be that if you weren't aware of the impact and the contributions coming in, then it now is really the time to start to think about whether or not, one, you'll use flexible furlough, and two, once the contributions come in, whether you can afford to keep people on furlough. So yeah, a lot.
I mean, the furlough scheme has been a lifesaver for businesses and employers.
Yeah.
You know, it's been of great help to my business, and I'm sure others during this sort of gradual reopening in the coming months.
Yeah.
as an employer, I have a duty of care to look after the health and safety of my staff, and failure to comply with these obligations could leave me exposed to legal claims. I mean, Jodie, what do I need to do in order to demonstrate that I've taken all reasonable steps to ensure a COVID-19 secure workplace?
So there's a couple of things. The first thing I would always say is actually look at the guidance. The guidance is changing, and as we heard last week, there's the 1 metre plus rule coming in. So the first point of call is, if you're looking to reopen, is to consider what guidance is the most up to date. Make sure you're always working for the most up to date, and make sure you do a risk assessments on your workplace. If you're not sure about how to do those, there are loads of companies out there. We don't do that. We're not a health and safety company, but there's loads of templates online, and there's loads of organisations who can come and do it for you if you're not sure. But effectively, you want to be ensuring that you're meeting the minimum guidance set out by the government, and you're not there to completely get rid of the risk. You're there to reduce it as much as possible. It's impossible to confirm to all staff there's no risk at all. But the reality here is, as an employer, as you say, you've got a duty of care, so you do have to consider, well, what are the risks to my workforce, and how can I minimise those as much as possible? The other thing I would say is, where someone is pregnant or disabled, or has been shielding, to conduct some individual assessments on those, because they are more high risk. And they're probably going to be more concerned about returning. So we've been running an advice line that's a free advice line, and that's all the questions that are coming in are around these people who are high risk and who are naturally more concerned because they're more likely to contract the virus. So just have that in mind. The other thing that's been really prevalent around returning to work and returning safely is where individuals don't feel it's safe and they refuse to come back to work, how employers deal with that. And that can be really challenging. Ultimately, there isn't a right or wrong way to deal with it. It's understanding, well, what is the reason why they can't return? And understanding, if it is because of health and safety, can you reduce the risk? Can they work from home? Or can you give them another role? And if you can't reduce the risk, or actually the risk is too high, it's making a judgment call then on what to do. So it's very much a case-by-case basis, but we're seeing a lot of people refusing to return to work at the moment, which is a real challenge for employers when they're trying to reopen.
Wow.
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, health and safety is an aspect that we're going to be covering in next week's webinar. So if you're looking for advice on that, join us next week for the health and safety, where we have a specialist joining us. I mean, coming back to that, I mean, for a small business like VU, where we are in occupied offices in sort of shared building, is that the responsibility? Is that my responsibility, or the responsibility of the landlord to ensure that we comply?
So we had this exact same discussion. We're at Thrive, there's only 10 of us. So we're also in a shared building, and our office was closed during lockdown. And when I went back in, the landlord had done everything. I actually thought it was my obligation. As an employer, I would have taken those steps anyway. So I think if your landlord hasn't done anything, then you would automatically have that obligation, because ultimately that duty of care is on you to make sure your employees are safe. Our landlord actually did everything that we needed. They put all the signs up, and they put little like circles on the floor, like if someone's coming down the stairs, wait here, don't cross. And so they were really good. But it's partly because we're owned by a university, so the building that we're in. So they were obviously really on it, but I think a lot of landlords are probably not. So if they aren't, don't wait for them to do it. You should step up and do that and put things in place.
And certainly, Vic, we have shared office space as well. And like Jodie, the landlord has tended to take care of the public spaces.
Yeah.
And put in the place the social distancing, the one-way traffic, but we're taking care of our own then office space on that particular floor, and making whatever changes we need to do there.
Oh, thanks, Paul. Actually, Paul, can you explain what happened at Bibby Financial Services when you went into lockdown, remote working, and furlough? I mean, how did you actually do it?
Yeah, it seems a long time ago now. We exited our 17 UK offices the week before official lockdown. So somewhere around, I think that was the weekend of about the 13th, 14th of March. and we still have the best part in the UK of 780 colleagues who are working from home. You know, out of that, we've got about 120 people who are on formal home working contracts, so they're used to that. But a big, massive proportion of I would say over 99% of our working population in the UK is still working from home. So we started off with an absolutely massive logistics operation, transferring and delivering kit from office to home. Obviously, a lot of people are, you know, have the laptop and therefore tap into their own broadband. But for those who didn't, we were delivering desktops and screens and ensuring that we were able to, that those colleagues were able to operate safely from home, but also to limit the impact on our clients. But they're in exactly the same situation as well, and many were decamping back into the home environment. So as well as getting people out to be able to work remotely and safely, we also adapted our people policies as well. We extended our holiday policy in line with the government guidelines, enabling individuals to carry their holiday over a 2-year period, rather than forcing people to take holiday during a time of furlough, although we will need to manage that obviously later in the year. We extended our sick pay provision and also our dependent leave provision as well as having a major focus on flexible working and understanding what that would need to be to meet individual needs. So if there was an opportunity for somebody to take time off during the middle of the day for childcare or dependent leave and go back online at 6 p.m, then we'd discuss that with them and agree that. But what we were very also keen to do is maintain, wherever possible, the gap between home working but also home life as well, because it can very easily merge and blur into one. The other thing we've done a lot of during this time out is reporting on a weekly basis, so that we know where every one of our colleagues is in terms of working from home, on holiday, if they're suffering from any symptoms, be it COVID or other illness. So at least we have a clear picture of the health and well-being of the teams. I think the other thing to say, and I'm sure this will come up later as well, is we've placed a major focus on communication during this lockdown time, both from a work and a social perspective. We run all UK calls. We have team, individual and furlough comms with our colleagues. And it's probably a bit of a sad indictment on where we were before in some ways, that a lot of colleagues are saying they feel better communicated to and engaged now than they did before. Also within that, a major focus on well-being, ensuring we're keeping in touch, both working and furloughed individuals, reminding all colleagues of what is available through our online, through apps, through external sources. We have an employee assistance program, for instance, but also a big message is, you know, it's okay not to be okay, and don't suffer in silence. And reach out if that is a necessity. And of course, our EU and Asia officers have followed a similar pattern in line with their local regulations, some of which have been, particularly Singapore, have been a lot tougher than the UK. You mentioned furlough, Vic. At the moment, we've got approximately 145 colleagues on furlough across our sales, operations, and central functions. And what we've tried to do, in where there's teams where it's a team of, let's say, 28, we split them into 4 groups, and where possible, we've rotated those teams on and off furlough to ensure a more even distribution. So some people will not have been on furlough for the full period. And so far, we've maintained payment of 100% of salary to all colleagues. And we see our use of furlough certainly continuing for the foreseeable future. And also interesting to note, our European officers have also been making use of their government schemes, particularly Germany and France. So yeah, I'm really proud of the organisation of how we've adapted and got out there and maintained, we've maintained our net promoter scores and Trustpilot scores. So far, so good in terms of the exercise to do that.
Oh, seems like you have it all in place, Paul.
Well, I don't know about that, Vic, but certainly I think we've done a very good job so far.
And what steps are you taking at BFS to ensure a safe return to the office?
Yeah, I'll pick up on something Jodie said earlier, and that's about the risk assessment. And we've adopted a sort of a 6-stage assessment to help make the decision as and when we'll return to an office. And that's based on the current government guidelines. And clearly that will, and I'll come back to this, that will change between the UK or Germany or France or our other locations. We'll also do a risk assessment against the public health situation. For instance, in the UK, the R rate. What is our industry body saying? What's the external infrastructure like? And I was on a call recently where I think there was somebody from either BP or Shell were on the call, and they were saying they would take a totally different view to an office opening in London, say, compared to Aberdeen. London partly because of the transport infrastructure and the ability to get to the office, whereas they were saying in Aberdeen most people could drive to the office, so it gives you a certain difference in approach. We'll look at our internal readiness in terms of how well prepared we are to go back, and our internal health rules as well, if there are any. So, but having said that, in the UK, if we were quick out of the office, we'll be slow and cautious to return. I don't see us being back much before late September or October. And our current office space calculations in terms of maintaining social distancing is that we'll probably return at about 30% capacity. And in doing so, when we return, we'll take all the normal precautions. We'll enact the social distancing, the whole piece around health and hygiene, be it through hand sanitizer, perspex screens, one-way building traffic, limited use of lifts, etc. And a bit of creativity's come through our Polish office, who have actually created a video journey through their office to show exactly what the environment will be like when they return. So I think that's good, at least to see that up front as to what can be expected. And interestingly, because of the difference in the situation in different countries, our Czech and Slovak offices have now reopened on a reduced capacity, mainly through the use of hybrid or split teams. Singapore will open on Wednesday, and our French office will open next Monday. And all of that is being managed through the risk assessment, but also very much in line with their local regulations.
Thank you, Paul. There's a question has come through from Paul Williamson. What do you do if you don't think the landlord is taking this seriously? I think he must be referring to the risk assessment.
Well, I don't know. I think it's outside of employment law. It's a landlord dispute. I think the first thing would be for me, I'd check the tenancy agreement and see who's obliged to do if it does deal with it. If it doesn't, I'd just write to them or pick up the phone and just ask them, what the reasons are, and trying to understand, especially where it's a shared space. So like Paul was saying, if you've got loads of you, it's then who does the shared space, isn't it? That makes it really difficult. I think trying to come to an agreement is definitely the best way forward. And if you can't come to an agreement with the landlord, perhaps come to an agreement with the other tenants to approach the landlord collectively. I think that's probably the best way to approach it.
Okay. We've got our second questions come in from Jenny. Can employees push out their holiday to after furlough and remain within the right to do so? Yeah,
so as Paul said before, whilst they've actually amended their policy in line with the change in the law, a new a new piece of legislation was effectively enacted, which allows employees to extend their entitlement over a period of 2 years. So previously it would just, you have to use it within a year. You don't have to use it in furlough. The furlough part is irrelevant to when you use your holiday. Your holiday, you can actually carry it over for 2 years, provided that the reason that you couldn't take it was because of COVID or something linked. So 99.9% of people have been affected. So I think pretty much it'll apply to everybody. Do you agree, Paul?
Yeah, I do. But we still do have people taking holiday now in furlough as well, who still want that
time
gap,
off,
that space, that time off, just to reboot and chill. But totally agree with what you said there, Jodie. And just got to be managed as you would normally manage your holiday calendar.
Yeah, we actually have one of my staff has taken off every other Friday, and she just said, I just want like a long weekend just to do nothing. I know she says, I know I can't go anywhere, but her big holiday had been cancelled, obviously. She had quite a lot to use up, and she was like, it can be quite stressful. Like the type of work that we're doing is very reactive. It's all about COVID, so that's all we're talking about all day. So having that extra space at the end of those weeks, she's found really helpful. And I did the same thing. I actually took 2 days off in fact last week when it was really warm, and it was great just to do nothing, because when like Paul was saying, when you're sat at home, you can find it really difficult to find that stop and start point when you're working from your home all the time, and especially when you're a business owner or a manager, there's always stuff you can be doing. So I think it is important still to encourage people to take some leave, but actually if you want to carry it over, there is still that option to do so.
All right, thank you. It seems like there is going to be plenty of remote working when this blows over. In the scenario where you have the majority of your team working remotely, there'll be a need to establish a culture that can engage and unify a team. Most people now will no longer be able to spend long periods of time together in the office as they used to do. And this has parallels with my England Rugby days, where you come together as a team infrequently. I mean, Catherine, as a former captain of England Women's Rugby team, what do you do to gel as a team, especially in the amateur era?
Yeah, well, my whole career was the amateur era. Not fortunate enough to experience a professional side of it, but so the majority of our time we weren't together. We weren't there, so we had to utilise those times really, really well. So a lot of the time when we were together in training camps, we were obviously on the rugby pitch. We were always trying to seek out opportunities to get to know each other as people. Behind the uniform, I guess, or away from the laptop or wherever it might be. It's so important to create those kind of emotional connections, I suppose, because it increases your performance on the pitch. But away from that, can't really do those kind of things now, can we? We can't go and meet up at marine spaces or military camps. I still have nightmares about Lympstone Marine Base and being forced to go under submerged water tunnels and things like that. Still didn't win the World Cup, but but aside from that, for us gelling as a team, I think having a very strong defined goal is really important, isn't it? So you're all working towards the same thing, lots of people coming together behind one arrow, as it were. So that was really important for us, whether it was a team, your goals to win the World Cup or your Six Nations or the next match, or as an individual, we always knew what our strength target was, or our fitness targets, and so on. And then lastly, probably the most simple thing actually, and possibly more relevant, when people are working from home and not together, we had a very simple phrase that I could probably guarantee that everyone playing the time when I did, and this was quite some years ago now, would remember, and that was simply, when no one is watching. And when no one is watching, that's probably when we performed the most. So for us, we had to be in the gym every day, or we had to be out on a cold, wet, muddy pitch running shuttles, which are horrible in dry, sunny conditions, let alone in the middle of winter. Or we had to be going to do sort of active recovery in the pool, or all these different kind of fitness sessions, but having to get out of bed at 5:30 in the morning to go and train before work, and so on. So we had this phrase, when no one is watching, And that was when our performance was higher, because we knew we had to do this for our teammates, because they'd be out there working harder. And we knew actually our competitors were as well. So actually we talk about gelling as a team, and we talk about all these things, we come together, or, you know, in rugby, we go down the pub and have a few pints together. Actually being apart, that short phrase, when no one is watching, was probably the strongest, most effective tool for us as a team that spent most time apart.
Fantastic. I mean, I recall in 2011 when I ran a charter flight and hotel package to the Klitschko Hay fight in Hamburg. I received a call from the CEO of Saracens, who simply booked 40 seats to the charter and tickets to the fight. No hotel. It was an overnight trip with the flight returning early next morning. The Saracens boys stayed out all night, and they most definitely gelled.
We won't talk about Saracens' finances and how they can afford charter flights, but there you go.
I mean, Paul, moving on. When colleagues return to the office, what will need to be different from a leadership management perspective?
Yeah, I think much of what we're doing already, I think, Vic, as when people are out of the office, and probably what we'd all list in sort of leadership 101, but we never quite achieve. And if I look back at what I've seen, the benefits and the practices that we've really put in place while being out of the office, I think it's about maintaining what has changed to date in that respect. Don't lose the regularity of the communication, the increased empathy that's been shown, the engagement and the trust that has been built up over the past 4 months. And certainly, if you speak to people or you read or attend the various seminars and webinars, then this continued focus on well-being is an absolute imperative. This has got to continue, and I'd say let's not lose that build that we've had in improved emotional intelligence. So I think that's one thing. We all know that in the return to the office, there are likely to be hybrid teams, home and office working within the same team, and we will need to give managers to lead in this environment. How will we ensure all colleagues, for instance, feel included? When you're having a mixture of a meeting that is both in the office but with people, be it on Zoom or Teams. How to ensure that people aren't micromanaged with a focus on task and process. So how do we make sure that managers are managing performance through outputs, and managers aren't sitting and waiting and sat back, are taking ownership and accountability to be that difference. And I just see the continued need for adaptability and flexibility. Don't stick to a decision just to appear decisive, because if we'd have done this through the pandemic, we'd have ended up in a totally different place. So always be more willing to review, I think, data, information and feedback as it becomes more available. And I think all of the above, what with doing that comes, I think, improvements in honesty, listening, and a bit of humility. It's not bad to not know all the answers. And I go back to what I said at the beginning, leadership 101, lead with the head, the heart, and the hands in order to implement. So that's what I say, Vic, from a leadership and management perspective.
Yes, and thank you, Paul. One thing that cannot be avoided is redundancy during this period, and we've seen plenty of companies, especially in travel and live events, that have been worst hit by the pandemic, announce large-scale redundancies. Jodie, can you please remind us of the rules around redundancy with regards to those on furlough?
Okay, so we don't have an hour, but I can do it in a nutshell. Redundancy is actually, in some respects, it's really complicated. In others, it's not. If you've got less than 20 employees, you just need to really focus on making sure that your redundancy process is fair. to make it fair, you need to have a fair selection criteria. And when we talk about selection criteria, it's looking at making sure that the criteria you're judging people on isn't discriminatory. So for example, if you're using sickness and someone has a disability, not placing as much weight on that, or policies like first in, last out could indirectly discriminate against people who are younger. So it's just making sure that you use an objective criteria, that you identify a pool of people who are all doing similar roles, and then you properly consult with them and understand whether or not there could be alternative employment within the workplace, whether or not actually there's ways to avoid the redundancy. Your staff might come up with something. So the meaningful side of the consultation is don't make the decision before you go in with an open mind and adopt that fair criteria. And I'd say if you've got under 20 employees, make sure you do at least 2 meetings with them. If you've got more than 20 employees, you're going into collective consultation territory. So it gets a bit more complicated. You've got to have employee representatives. You've got to ensure that you comply with the statutory consultation timeframes, depending on how many employees you have. So there's a lot more to it when you go into those realms. And I would strongly recommend taking advice if you're in that territory, because the risks are much higher. And what I mean by that is that if you get it wrong, we saw a case recently, Jamie Oliver didn't do the consultation properly, ended up having to pay 90 days per employee in compensation out. So, getting it wrong can be really expensive. And so not only is it the nice and the kind thing to do to people who are losing their jobs, like talk to them about it, spend as much time as possible going through all the options, explaining why it's happening. Obviously we're in a pandemic and people get it, but some people won't appreciate why their role. So it's making it a little, I think from my perspective as a lawyer, I try to bring in the human angle as well, and not just make it as brutal as your role's going by, because we're seeing quite a lot of that coming through, and it's pretty hard. And I know it's hard for employers, but in order to stay on the right side of the law, you need to consult fairly. And if you do find yourself in a situation where the employee is challenging it, you've gone through an appeal process and they're still challenging it, then it's likely that they'll go to a tribunal. And at the moment, tribunals, there are no fees, so there's no risk in them bringing a claim. So we're seeing a lot of people going to tribunal at the moment. So my advice is, if it gets to that point, just take some advice, and it might be something that you can sort in the ACAS process rather than letting it get protracted into the tribunal. But yeah, in a real nutshell, because it's a really, really complex area. But we're actually publishing a couple of blogs on that this week on how to do it fairly. So if anyone is kind of going down that process, we're doing some step-by-step guides on that. So keep an eye out on our website. We've got a couple of bits coming up that, like I say, go into a lot more detail. But that's kind of your headline points.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie, for that. In the theme of redundancy, Catherine, we've both been here. How did you cope with being dropped by England?
Vic, it's difficult for me to answer this question without either sounding arrogant or smug, but I haven't actually been there because I was never dropped by England. So I was very fortunate in that regards. I was injured very early on in my career. I'd only got a couple of caps for England. When we're then due to go out to Canada on tour, it was like the biggest thing for me at the time. And I injured my knee playing for my club, actually. And I had to make the call to my coach, so I couldn't go on this tour. And I thought that early on that was going to be it. That was my England career gone. And then I got perspective and rehabbed really well over the summer, ran up and down the Shingle Beach near where I live, and got back into the squad. But it was kind of that distance, that time away, that actually made me realise how much I wanted it. How much I wanted to be there. And it kind of re-motivated me in a way, and I probably needed that. I needed that break at that stage in my career, even though it was quite early on. So I can kind of understand what it's like from that perspective. And then when I became captain, obviously I had to deal with this with other players, and actually some of my peers, some of my friends. I was involved in those selection choices and decisions, and sometimes I knew that actually best mates were going to be dropped before they were, which was really hard. The most important thing that came out of that really was the need for, what's it called, active followership, I think it's called that, when you're actually displaying sort of leadership qualities and supporting your your superiors, you know, as kind of a middle manager, as it were. And lots of people are going to be experiencing that, aren't they, in this time, and, you know, having to furlough staff, and, you know, if it gets staged with redundancy, it's really difficult. But that importance of really supporting your senior management to ensure that actually the team or the organisation stays strong, and fractures don't appear, which is obviously easier said than done. But that was quite hard as a captain, sort of being involved in those decisions, and then sort of seeing how different people respond to that, to being dropped. So Maggie Alfonsi, for those of you that might not know, was probably the world's best rugby player. She played alongside me in the back row. I always said I made her look good because I did all her work for her, but then I retired and she was still good. So I think a different theory. But she was really like the world's best player. But to start with, she played a different position. She played centre for England. She got a couple of caps, but then she didn't get picked again. So she was good, but she wasn't great. So it's like, how can she get back in the squad? So she actually changed position to the forwards and became an open side flanker, and that was the making of her. She was good, but she became great. I mean, she became more than great, really. So she was kind of, how can she change something? But then the other example, another player for England, Sophie Hemming. So she played tight head prop. So for those of you who don't know, if you play tight head prop, if you play prop, I think this is right, Vic, isn't it? Not many other positions that you're going to be playing in. So she knew that was a position, but she knew she wanted to play for England. So actually she did all that she could. She became expert in her trade. She got there through sheer hard work and determination. And she became indispensable, really. She became one of the best players in her position for her era. So it was kind of seeing the reactions of people, how they deal with being dropped and selection. And, you know, like teams and like organisations, some people will thrive on being told they can't do something. Some people will thrive on being told that actually you're really good, and building their confidence. So I guess something we have to be focused on when people are so remote is knowing each other, knowing how different people within these teams work, keeping the wider team strong, and supporting your leaders above you. So yeah, so Vic, going back to your original question, sorry, I couldn't really answer it because I was never dropped, but I have a bit of experience being away from the team through injury.
Thank you, Catherine. We've got time for a couple of questions, so if anyone's got any question, do pop it in the chat or in the question box.
There's one here for me. Let me just read it. Jodie, you touched on tribunals. I was wondering, if an employer has provided outplacement support to employees facing redundancy, will that be viewed more favourably at a tribunal? Is this something you would recommend? So first of all, when the tribunal are looking at the fairness of the dismissal, it's not necessarily about what you did afterwards. So it's about what's in the mind of the dismisser. So first of all, whether the dismissal was fair, whether you have a fair reason. So yeah, redundancy, hopefully that fits for most people in the current climate. But then it's whether or not that individual was selected fairly. So it's not necessarily that it would be viewed more favourably. What would happen is, by providing them with outplacement, I think I would recommend it, because it's likely to get them a job quicker, and the value of their claim will then reduce, because the tribunal will only award 12 months loss of earnings plus they'll have already been paid their redundancy. So if they find another job, they're only awarded up to the value up to when they get a new job, basically. So it is helpful to help that person find another job. So things like outplacement can assist in reducing the value of a claim. I don't think that it would necessarily make it a fairer dismissal, though, because it's not about the fairness. Do you agree, Paul?
Yeah, and it's interesting. We were in a major restructure before furlough, before lockdown struck, and we've continued that in a virtual way. But everybody who was involved in that program has been offered outsourcing, and probably an 85% take up from that group. So the right thing to do, but totally agree with you, Jodie. I can't see a tribunal taking it into account in terms of being favourable or not versus the original decision taken.
Yeah, because what they actually look at is they look at whether the decision to dismiss is fair. So it's not necessarily what you've done to support them afterwards or anything else. It's about that actual decision. And that sometimes can be quite difficult for employers to get their head around, because actually the tribunal won't rerun that either. They don't rerun the redundancy process. They just look at, well, given the circumstances and the information that person had in that meeting, was it fair? And also, was it within the band of reasonable responses? So that would actually fall outside of what their decision-making powers would be. But I agree with Paul. I think it's a really good idea, not least because it's the right thing to do to help people at this time, but also from a purely legal perspective, it would reduce the value of any claim if they did get another job.
Thank you, Jodie. I think we're almost out of time. So I'm going to summarize. I mean, the key points that I'll be taking away from today's webinar: flexible furlough starts tomorrow. Make sure you have a written agreement in place. Carry out a COVID assessment risk. Redundancy, act now to ensure you have enough time to conduct the process. Flexible working hours is the way forward. Regular communication with your employees, very, very important. And when no one's watching, the effort that goes in is very important as well. Thank you, Jodie. Thank you, Catherine and Paul, for sharing your experience and practical advice. Thank you all for attending. I'll email a link of today's webinar. It'll be great to get your feedback, and please share with your colleagues. This webinar will also be posted as a podcast on Spotify, Apple, and other platforms. Our next practical guide for getting back to work focuses on health and safety. This will be on Tuesday, the 7th of July at 12 o'clock. I'll be joined by Peter Kinselli, who's an Associate Director at Cardinals Risk Management, a leading risk management consultancy. Rugby legend and executive coach at Preston Associates, Lee Mears. Former Bath England fullback, Jonathan Webb, who is an orthopedic knee surgeon and has operated on a global array of international athletes, and will share stories from his sporting injury operations. Registration is free. We're looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you and goodbye.